Welcome to this journey into one of Louisiana's most disturbing and enigmatic historical mysteries. I'm glad you're here with us tonight, joining our community of those who seek answers in the shadows of forgotten history. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Take a moment and tell us in the comments below where you are right now and what time it is in your part of the world. Are you listening alone in the dark, during a quiet afternoon? We love knowing when and where our stories find you, creating this strange connection across time and space as we explore the unexplainable together. The year is 1851. The place is St. Martin Parish, Louisiana, in the heart of what locals still call the French Triangle, a region where old customs died hard and older beliefs never died at all. The cotton plantations stretched for miles along the bayous, white columns of grand houses rising from the mist like monuments to wealth built on suffering. It was here, in the brutal winter of that year, that three men vanished from the face of the earth, not disappeared in the conventional sense, not murdered in any way that investigators could prove, not even dead according to some testimonies, though no one ever saw them alive again. Their names were Henri Duval, age 52, patriarch of the Bellemonte Plantation; his eldest son, Armand Duval, 30 years old, already known for his cruelty toward the enslaved people who worked his father's land; and Julien Duval, 27, the quieter brother, but no less complicit in the horrors that occurred daily within Bellemonte's boundaries. What connects these three disappearances? What makes this case extraordinary, even by the standards of that dark period in American history, is a single, chilling detail that appeared in every witness testimony, every investigative report, every newspaper article that dared to cover the story. The coats. Each man, before vanishing, had been seen wearing a magnificent new coat, custom-tailored, exquisitely crafted, stitched by the most talented seamstress on the plantation. A woman whose name would become synonymous with vengeance, with mystery, with something far darker than simple murder. Her name was Celeste Marchand. She was 28 years old. She was enslaved, and according to documents that would surface decades later, she possessed a skill that went far beyond needle and thread. The coats were found, empty, abandoned in locations that made no sense. A ruined chapel 3 miles from the plantation house, a burned-out slave cabin, the cemetery where enslaved people were buried in unmarked graves, each coat perfectly intact, showing no signs of violence, no blood, no tears in the fabric. But the men who wore them were never seen again. What happened in the winter of 1851 at Bellemonte Plantation? How does a woman with no freedom, no resources, no apparent means of escape or violence, make 3 grown men vanish as if they had been sown out of existence itself? The answer, if there even is one, lies buried in court records, slave narratives, Louisiana folklore, and the terrifying testimonies of those who survived that winter and spent the rest of their lives trying to forget what they witnessed. This is the story of Celeste Marchand. This is the story of justice stitched in darkness. This is the story of 3 coats that became shrouds for men who wore their sins on their backs. And this is a story that to this day has never been fully explained. To understand what happened at Bellemonte, we must first understand the world that created it. Louisiana in 1851 was a place of profound contradictions. New Orleans was becoming one of the wealthiest cities in America, its port filled with ships carrying cotton, sugar, and human beings sold as property. The French and Spanish colonial influences remained strong, creating a cultural mixture unlike anywhere else in the United States. But beneath the grand balls and the magnificent architecture, Louisiana's economy ran on blood and suffering. By 1850, there were over 330,000 enslaved people in Louisiana alone. On plantations like Bellemonte, they outnumbered white residents by ratios as high as 20 to 1. The Duval family had owned Bellemonte for 3 generations. The plantation sprawled across 2,000 acres of rich alluvial soil, perfect for cotton cultivation. Tax records from 1850 indicate that Henri Duval owned 147 enslaved people. He was considered a successful planter, a respected member of the Louisiana Planters Association, a man whose word carried weight in parish politics. But plantation ledgers tell a different story than the one found in society pages. Punishment records, required by Louisiana law to be kept, show that Bellemonte had an unusually high rate of what were euphemistically called disciplinary actions: whipping posts, isolation boxes, brandings. The ledgers are clinical in their horror, listing punishments the way a shopkeeper might list inventory. Henri Duval's wife, Marguerite, had died in 1843 under circumstances that remain unclear. Some records suggest childbirth complications, others hint at something more disturbing. After her death, Henri and his two sons ran the plantation with increasing brutality. Former slaves who gave testimonies after the Civil War described Bellemonte as one of the cruelest plantations in St. Martin Parish, which is saying something in a region known for its violence. The enslaved community at Bellemonte had its own hierarchy, its own culture, its own ways of resistance. They came from different parts of West Africa, from Haiti after the revolution, from other plantations sold off by bankrupt owners. They brought with them their languages, their religions, their survival strategies. Among them was a woman named Celeste. Records of her purchase exist in the St. Martin Parish courthouse, preserved in a leather-bound ledger that still smells of mildew and old ink. She was bought in New Orleans in 1838, age 15, sold by a French merchant who listed her skills as exceptional seamstress, literate in French, trained in household service. The price was unusually high, $520. For context, most enslaved people sold for between $300 and $400 at that time. Why so expensive? The notation in the margin provides a clue. Daughter of Marie Marchand, it reads, trained in the tradition. What tradition? The ledger doesn't say, but those familiar with Louisiana's complex spiritual landscape understand the implication. Marie Marchand was a known practitioner of what white people called voodoo, what the enslaved community called vaudou, what scholars now recognize as a syncretic religion combining West African spiritual practices with Catholicism and indigenous beliefs. Marie Marchand died in 1840, 2 years after her daughter was sold to the Duvals. The cause of death was listed as fever, but whispers in the enslaved community told a different story. They said she cursed the man who sold her daughter. They said he died 3 months later, drowning in the Mississippi despite being an excellent swimmer. They said Marie's spirit never left Louisiana, that she waited in the spaces between things for the chance to continue what she had started. Celeste inherited more than her mother's sewing skills. She inherited knowledge, she inherited purpose, and she inherited rage. For 13 years, she lived at Bellemonte. For 13 years, she served in the main house, sewing clothes for the Duval family, mending tears, creating elaborate garments for balls and social functions. She was considered valuable property. She was allowed to sleep in a small room attached to the sewing quarters rather than the slave cabins. She was given better food, better clothes, small privileges that were meant to ensure her compliance. But privileges on a plantation are just longer. Chains. In the months before the disappearances, several witnesses noted changes in Celeste's behavior. A house slave named Ruth, whose testimony was recorded in 1866, described Celeste as becoming more withdrawn, spending long hours in the sewing room, even when there was no work to be done. She sang to herself in a language Ruth didn't recognize. She collected things: chicken bones, Spanish moss, rusty nails, silk threads dyed in colors that seemed to shift in the light. The Duval men noticed nothing. To them, Celeste was furniture, a tool, invisible unless they needed something from her. That invisibility would become their undoing. In November 1851, Henri Duval ordered new winter coats for himself and his sons. Louisiana winters are mild by northern standards, but the dampness from the bayous cuts through thin fabric. He wanted something substantial, something that would announce their status even in cold weather. He told Celeste she had 1 month to complete 3 coats, custom-tailored, wool and silk lined with the finest fabric. He told her if she failed, she would be punished. He told her this while standing too close, his breath smelling of whiskey and tobacco, his hand on her shoulder in a way that was both threat and promise. Celeste said, "Yes, master." Celeste lowered her eyes. Celeste went to her sewing room, and Celeste began to work. The first coat was completed on December 3rd, 1851, a Wednesday. The weather that day was unseasonably cold, with fog rolling in from the bayous so thick that the slave cabins disappeared from view when seen from the main house. Henri Duval tried on the coat in the parlor. Multiple witnesses were present. His sons, the house slaves, a visiting planter named Charles Beaumont, who had come to discuss cotton prices. Everyone agreed the coat was magnificent, deep charcoal wool, almost black, with a silk lining in midnight blue that seemed to shimmer when Henry moved. The fit was perfect, tailored precisely to his frame. The stitching was so fine it was nearly invisible. Along the lapels and cuffs, Celeste had embroidered subtle patterns in matching thread, decorative but not ostentatious. Henri was pleased. He wore the coat the rest of that day and evening. He wore it to dinner. He wore it when he retired to his study to review plantation accounts. At approximately 10 o'clock that night, according to testimony from the house slave who was cleaning the hallway, Henri walked out of his study, down the main staircase, and out the front door of the plantation house. He never came back. The alarm wasn't raised until morning. The Duval men often spent nights away from the house, visiting neighboring plantations, staying in New Orleans for business. It wasn't until Armand went to his father's study to retrieve some documents and found the room exactly as Henri had left it, lamp still burning, ledgers open, reading glasses on the desk, that anyone realized something was wrong. A search party was organized immediately. Overseers, neighboring planters, even some of the enslaved men were ordered to search the grounds. They combed the cotton fields, the bayou paths, the nearby woods. They dragged sections of the water. They searched every building on the property. They found nothing, no body, no signs of struggle, no indication that Henri Duval had met with violence or accident. It was as if he had simply walked into the fog and ceased to exist. The coat was found 3 days later. A field hand named Samuel discovered it hanging on a wooden cross in the slave cemetery, the burial ground where the enslaved dead were interred, without markers, without names, without acknowledgement that they had ever lived at all. The coat was perfectly intact. No mud, no tears, no blood. It hung on that cross as if someone had carefully arranged it there, arms spread wide in a mockery of crucifixion. The silk lining fluttered in the wind, catching the light in ways that made several witnesses step back in instinctive fear. When the coat was examined more closely, investigators made a disturbing discovery. The embroidered patterns along the lapels and cuffs, which had seemed merely decorative in the lamplight of the parlor, revealed themselves to be something else entirely in daylight. They were symbols, intricate, deliberate, woven so subtly into the fabric that they were nearly invisible unless you knew what to look for. A local priest brought in to examine the coat turned pale when he saw them. He refused to comment on their meaning, but he did say one thing before hurrying away from Bellemonte. These are not Christian symbols. The investigation into Henri's disappearance was still ongoing when Armand Duval made a decision that would seal his fate. He demanded that Celeste finish his coat immediately. He wanted it done. He wanted it now, and he didn't care that his father had just vanished under inexplicable circumstances while wearing one of her creations. Perhaps he saw it as a power move, a way of asserting control in a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's understanding. Perhaps he simply couldn't imagine that an enslaved woman could be dangerous. Perhaps his cruelty ran so deep that it blinded him to obvious danger. Celeste completed Armand's coat on December 15th. Dark brown wool lined with burgundy silk. The fit was perfect. The stitching was exquisite, and along the inner lining, where only the wearer would see it, Celeste had embroidered his name in thread so fine it looked like calligraphy. Armand wore the coat that evening. He wore it to a dinner at a neighboring plantation, where several witnesses saw him laughing and drinking, showing off the craftsmanship, boasting about how even the threat of his father's disappearance couldn't disturb the proper running of Bellemonte. He returned to the plantation around midnight. The night watchman, an enslaved man named Jacob, testified later that he saw Armand's horse return, saw Armand dismount, saw him walk toward the stable, and then, in Jacob's words, he stepped into the shadow of the barn, and he didn't come out the other side. I waited. I watched, but he was gone. Just gone. The horse stood there alone, bridle hanging loose, breath steaming in the cold air. The stable door creaked open and shut in the wind. And Armand Duval had vanished. His coat was found the next morning in the burned ruins of a slave cabin that had been destroyed by fire 6 months earlier. The structure was nothing but charred timbers and ash, but the coat lay spread across the ground, perfectly clean, untouched by the soot and debris surrounding it. When investigators examined this coat, they found the same subtle symbols woven into the fabric. But this time, there was something else, written on the inner lining in ink that seemed to shift between brown and red depending on the light, was a single sentence in French. Le prix du sang est le sang. The price of blood is blood. Now tell us in the comments what you think is happening so far. Do you believe Celeste is using some kind of supernatural power? Do you think there's a rational explanation? What would you do if you were investigating this case in 1851? We want to hear your theories. At this point, pure terror had seized Bellemonte and the surrounding area. 2 men had vanished within 2 weeks. Both had been wearing coats made by the same enslaved woman. Both coats had been found in locations heavy with symbolism, in places associated with death and suffering. Julien Duval, the youngest son, was advised by neighbors to leave Louisiana immediately. A planter named Michel Benoit reportedly told him, "That woman has marked you for death. Leave now, or you'll follow your father and brother into whatever hell they found." But Julien didn't leave. Whether it was pride, disbelief, or something darker, a compulsion he couldn't name, Julien Duval decided to stay at Bellemonte. And more than that, he demanded that Celeste complete the 3rd coat, his coat. The completion of Julien's coat took longer than the others. Celeste worked on it through Christmas, through the New Year, into January of 1852. She worked by candlelight in her sewing room, the door closed, admitting no visitors. House slaves reported hearing her singing, the melody rising and falling in patterns that didn't follow any recognizable tune. The plantation had become a place of fear. Many of the enslaved people had begun wearing small cloth pouches around their necks, gris-gris bags filled with herbs and stones for protection. They avoided the main house when possible. They spoke in whispers about Celeste, about whether she was a hero or something more dangerous, something that might not distinguish between oppressor and oppressed when the reckoning came. The white community debated what to do. Some argued that Celeste should be arrested, examined, even executed. Others pointed out that she had done nothing that could be proven. She had sewn coats, that was all. The disappearances might be pure coincidence. The symbols on the coats might be meaningless decoration. But underneath these rational arguments ran a current of genuine terror. Louisiana in the 1850s was a place where African spiritual practices were both forbidden and deeply feared. The word voodoo was spoken in whispers, associated with poisonings, mysterious deaths, invisible vengeance. White people who built their fortunes on the labor of enslaved Africans lived in constant fear that those same people possessed powers they couldn't understand or control. Julien Duval tried to project confidence. He continued managing the plantation, attending church, acting as if nothing unusual was happening. But witnesses described him as haggard, pale, jumping at shadows. He began sleeping with a loaded pistol by his bed. He had the locks changed on his bedroom door. He started eating food that he prepared himself, paranoid about poisoning. On January 7th, 1852, Celeste brought Julien his completed coat. It was the finest of the three. Navy blue wool, so dark it appeared black in dim light. The lining was silver-gray silk that seemed to glow with its own internal light. The stitching was perfect. The fit, when Julien tried it on in front of the hallway mirror, was absolutely precise. Along the collar, barely visible, Celeste had embroidered a pattern that looked like vines. Only upon close inspection would someone notice that the vines were actually words, French words, stitched in a spiral that led from the right shoulder to the left. What the words said would not be discovered until much later. Julien wore the coat that evening. A house slave named Martha, who had been assigned to stay with Julien at all times as a safety measure, watched him walk from the parlor to the library, carrying a glass of brandy and a book. She testified that she looked away for perhaps 3 seconds. Just 3 seconds. When she looked back, the library was empty. The brandy glass sat on the side table, still full. The book lay open on the chair. The door to the library, the only door, had not opened or closed. Julien Duval had vanished. This time, no one waited to organize a search party. Every able-bodied person on the plantation, enslaved and free, was ordered to search immediately. They searched through the night, through the next day, through the following week. Julien's coat was found in the chapel ruins, the same location where Henry's coat should have been found but wasn't, a small stone building that had collapsed decades earlier and now stood as a skeleton of what it once was. The coat was arranged on what remained of the altar, arms spread wide, empty, pristine. But this time, when investigators examined the coat, they made a discovery that would haunt everyone who heard about it. Inside the lining, sewn into the fabric itself, was a small leather pouch. When carefully opened, it contained 3 items: a lock of dark hair, a fragment of newspaper dated November 1840, and a small piece of paper with writing in a feminine hand. The newspaper fragment reported a drowning in New Orleans. A merchant named Philippe Beauchamp lost in the Mississippi River under mysterious circumstances. The writing on the paper was in French, barely legible, but the words that could be made out translated approximately to, "For what was taken, the payment comes. For what was broken, the mending. For what was stolen, the return." Through cloth and bone. Investigators finally connected the name Beauchamp to Celeste. Philippe Beauchamp was the merchant who had sold her to the Duvals in 1838. The same merchant whose death was whispered to be the result of Marie Marchand's curse. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, but the pattern was so far outside the realm of what could be believed, what could be proven, that authorities struggled to even articulate what they suspected. A formal investigation was launched in late January 1852. The lead investigator was a man named Auguste Moreau, a former magistrate from New Orleans who had experience with what he delicately termed unusual cases in the Louisiana Territory. His reports, preserved in the St. Martin Parish archives, make for disturbing reading. Moreau interviewed everyone at Bellemonte. He examined the coats, the locations where they were found, the plantation records going back decades. He brought in experts, doctors, to examine the coats for poisons or other physical evidence, a Catholic priest to assess the spiritual implications, even a professor from New Orleans who specialized in what was then called anthropology. None of them could explain what had happened. The coats showed no signs of struggle, no blood, no chemical residues. The symbols embroidered into them were identified by the anthropology professor as likely derived from West African spiritual traditions, specifically those associated with the Fon people of Dahomey, combined with elements of Haitian Vodou. Their purpose appeared to be protective or binding, though their exact meaning remained unclear. More disturbing were the testimonies from the enslaved community at Bellemonte. Many refused to speak at all. Those who did spoke in careful, measured words, clearly terrified of saying too much. But fragments emerged. An elderly woman named Adeline, who had known Celeste since she arrived at the plantation, described her as having the gift, the same gift her mother possessed. When pressed on what this meant, Adeline would only say, "Some people can see the threads that connect things. Some people can pull on those threads. Some people can cut them." A young man named Thomas, who worked in the house, reported that in the weeks before the disappearances, he had seen Celeste collecting specific items during the full moon: water from the bayou at midnight, dirt from crossroads, bones from the slave cemetery. He saw her weaving these items into the coats as she worked, sewing them into the hems and linings where they would never be visible. Most chilling was the testimony of Ruth, the house slave who had observed Celeste most closely. She described watching Celeste sew the final coat for Julian. As Celeste worked, Ruth said, the candle flames in the room bent toward her, pulled by an invisible force. The shadows on the walls moved independently of any light source, and Celeste spoke to the coat as she sewed, whispering to it in languages Ruth didn't recognize, as if the garment itself was alive and listening. Moreau's recommendation to the parish authorities was unprecedented. He could not prove that Celeste Marchand had murdered anyone. He could not even prove that the three men were dead. But he concluded this woman represents a danger that exists outside the bounds of what our legal system is equipped to address. Whether through unknown scientific means or through spiritual practices that we do not understand, she has demonstrated an ability to cause the disappearance of three men. She should be removed from the plantation and placed under constant supervision. But before any action could be taken, Celeste herself disappeared. On February 14, 1852, she was seen at dawn by the overseer's wife, walking toward the bayou with a small bundle. By mid-morning, when a search was conducted, she was gone. A massive manhunt was organized. Bounty hunters were hired. Notices were posted throughout Louisiana. The reward for her capture, dead or alive, was set at $1,000, an enormous sum that indicated how desperately the authorities wanted to find her. She was never found. Over the following months and years, reported sightings came from across Louisiana, from Mississippi, from as far away as Texas. A woman matching her description was seen in New Orleans market, selling herbs and fabric. Another sighting placed her in a maroon community deep in the swamps, teaching other escaped slaves the old ways. A trader reported seeing her on a ship bound for Haiti, standing at the rail and staring back at the Louisiana coast, as if memorizing it. All of these sightings were investigated. None led anywhere conclusive. In the immediate aftermath of the disappearances and Celeste's escape, Bellemonte Plantation descended into chaos. Without the Duval men, without clear ownership, The plantation's operations ground to a halt. Distant relatives attempted to claim the property, but legal complications arose. Louisiana law required proof of death to transfer inheritance. The three Duval men were missing, not dead. Their bodies had never been found. They could not legally be declared deceased for 7 years. In the meantime, the enslaved people of Bellemonte existed in a strange limbo. Technically, they were still property of the Duval estate. But with no one clearly in charge, enforcement of plantation discipline broke down. Some enslaved people began leaving, walking away from Bellemonte in small groups, risking the terrible punishment of being caught as runaways because the alternative of staying seemed worse. Strange things began happening at the plantation house itself. Multiple witnesses reported seeing lights in the windows of the abandoned Duval bedrooms late at night. Neighbors heard sounds coming from the empty house, footsteps, voices. The sound of sewing machines operating through the plantation had no electricity, and the sewing room stood dark and locked. A caretaker hired to maintain the property reported finding 3 new coats hanging in the main parlor one morning. Navy blue, dark brown, and charcoal, matching the descriptions of the original 3 coats. When he tried to remove them, he said they felt unnaturally heavy, as if something was inside them. He fled the plantation that day and refused to return. The 3 coats found at the crime scenes, the original coats, were held as evidence by the parish authorities. They were stored in a locked room in the courthouse, each coat carefully folded and labeled. In March 1853, a courthouse clerk named Antoine Dumas was conducting an inventory. He opened the storage room and found it empty. The 3 coats were gone. The door had been locked from the inside. The windows were barred and showed no signs of being tampered with. An investigation revealed no evidence of theft. The coats had simply vanished, much like the men who wore them. In 1859, Bellemonte Plantation was finally sold at auction. The buyer was a cotton merchant from Baton Rouge who had never heard the stories and got the property for a fraction of its value. He moved his family into the main house, hired new workers, attempted to restore the plantation to profitability. Within 6 months, his entire family had left. They refused to discuss what happened, but the merchant told one friend, "I saw things in that house that no Christian man should see. I heard voices coming from empty rooms. My wife found sewing needles arranged in patterns on the floor of the bedroom, forming symbols we didn't recognize. The overseer's boy claimed he saw a woman in the old sewing room, working at a machine that wasn't there, creating coats for people who didn't exist." After 1859, Bellemonte was never successfully occupied again. Various owners tried. All of them left within months or weeks, reporting similar phenomena. The house fell into disrepair. The fields returned to wilderness. By the time of the Civil War, Bellemonte had become a ghost plantation, a place that locals avoided after dark. But the story of Celeste and the 3 coats spread far beyond St. Martin Parish. The tale was told in slave quarters throughout the South, passed from person to person as a story of invisible justice, of power hidden in the hands of those considered powerless. Different versions emerged. Some said Celeste had learned the old ways from her mother. Others said she made a bargain with spirits that lived in the bayou. Still others claimed she simply knew how to sew curses into fabric, how to bind men's souls to cloth and then unmake both at will. The story became folklore, became legend, became something that existed in the space between history and myth. It was told in different forms with different details, but the core remained the same. A seamstress who made her oppressors vanish, leaving only their empty coats as evidence that they had ever existed at all. The story of Celeste Marchand and Bellemonte Plantation might have faded entirely into legend if not for discoveries made decades later that reignited interest in the case. In 1923, a researcher named Dr. Eleanor Hawthorne from Tulane University was conducting oral history interviews with descendants of enslaved people in Louisiana. She was in New Iberia, not far from the site of the old Bellemonte Plantation, when she met a woman named Sarah Mitchell, age 87. Sarah's grandmother had been enslaved at Bellemonte. She had known Celeste Marchand. Dr. Hawthorne's notes from that interview, preserved in the Tulane University archives, are extraordinary. Sarah spoke for over 3 hours, sharing stories that had been passed down through her family for 70 years. She described Celeste as a woman who carried both her mother's gift and her mother's burden, someone who understood that there are powers in the world that don't bow to human laws. According to Sarah's grandmother, Celeste had been planning the disappearances for years. She had been gathering what she needed, preparing, waiting for the right moment. The 3 coats were not acts of sudden vengeance, but careful, deliberate workings that required specific materials, specific timing, specific words sewn into fabric at specific phases of the moon. Sarah described the process. Celeste would sew symbols into the lining, invisible patterns that created what Sarah's grandmother called a binding. She would collect personal items from each man, hair or skin cells or threads from clothes they had worn, anything that carried their essence. These items would be sewn into the coat itself, hidden in the seams and hems. And as she sewed, she would speak the person's name over and over, binding them to the fabric, making the coat and the man the same thing. Once the coat was completed and worn, the binding was activated. The man became part of the coat. And when the coat was removed, when it was left empty in a place of significance, the man ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Where did they go? Dr. Hawthorne asked. Sarah's response is chilling. My grandmother said they went into the cloth. They became part of the pattern, and when the coats disappeared from the courthouse, when they vanished like smoke, the men went with them, into whatever darkness Celeste had woven into those garments. This interview might have been dismissed as folklore if not for a discovery made in 1947. A historian named Marcus Webb was researching property records in New Orleans when he came across a box of documents that had been misfiled for nearly a century. Among them was a letter dated April 1852, written by a woman who signed herself only as CM. The letter was addressed to no one, or perhaps to everyone. It was written in French, in an elegant hand, on paper that had yellowed with age but remained surprisingly intact. Dr. Webb had it translated and published in the Louisiana Historical Quarterly in 1948. The letter reads, in part, I am writing this so that someone, someday, will know the truth of what happened at Bellemonte. I am writing this because stories change in the telling, and I want at least one version to exist that comes from my own hand. They say I murdered 3 men. They say I used dark magic, evil spells, powers borrowed from demons. This is not true. I used the only power I had, the power to see clearly what men refused to see. I saw the threads that connected those men to the suffering they caused. I saw how their violence had woven itself into the fabric of that place, into the land and the air and the people who lived and died there. And I understood that sometimes the only way to cut those threads is to gather them together, to pull them tight, and to unmake them at the source. I did not kill the Duvals. I unstitched them from the world. The letter continues with details about her escape, though these sections are damaged and difficult to read. What remains clear is the final paragraph. My mother told me that every thread connects to every other thread, that nothing truly disappears, it only transforms. The coat still exists somewhere, the men still exist somewhere, but not in this world, not in any form that can harm anyone again. I have sewn them into a place where they will spend eternity wearing their sins, where the weight of what they did will press upon them like heavy cloth forever and always. This is not revenge, this is balance. The authenticity of this letter has been debated by historians. Some argue it's a forgery, created by someone familiar with the Celeste Marchand story. Others point to the paper, the ink, the handwriting analysis, all of which suggest it genuinely dates to the 1850s. The debate continues to this day. In 1958, another piece of the puzzle emerged. A descendant of one of the enslaved families from Bellemonte donated a box of materials to the Louisiana State Museum. Among the items was a small cloth journal, pages sewn together by hand, filled with drawings and notations. In multiple languages, the journal had belonged to Celeste Marchand. The entries are fragmentary, some in French, some in what linguists identified as Fon, a language from the Kingdom of Dahomey in West Africa. The drawings show intricate patterns, symbols, designs for garments. Margin notes explain the significance of certain stitches, certain arrangements of thread, certain combinations of fabric, and found objects. One page, dated November 1851, shows the design for a coat. Around it are notations: full moon, crossroads dirt, cemetery water, bone needle for the binding stitch. His name spoken 7 times 7. The thread must be soaked in my blood, then dried in darkness. Museum curators who examined the journal noted something disturbing. Several pages had been torn out, removed carefully along the binding. These missing pages corresponded roughly to the time period when the 3 Duval coats would have been completed. Where those pages went, what they contained, remains unknown. Matesich, in 1976, during the renovation of an old house in New Orleans' French Quarter, construction workers found a wooden chest hidden behind a false wall. Inside were 3 bolts of fabric: charcoal wool, brown wool, and navy blue wool. Each bolt had been partially used, the cut edges showing the distinctive marks of professional tailoring shears. Wrapped with the fabric were 3 spools of thread, in colors matching the silk linings of the 3 Duval coats. And tucked into the center of the chest was a small card with a single word written in faded ink: inachevé, unfinished. The house had been owned in the 1850s by a free woman of color who ran a boarding house. Records show she occasionally sheltered people escaping north. Whether she helped Celeste, whether the chest was left there deliberately or hidden for safety, is impossible to know. The fabric and thread were donated to the Louisiana State Museum, where they remain in the collection today. Visitors can request to see them, though few do. Those who work in the Textile Conservation Department report an odd phenomenon. The fabrics, despite being over 170 years old, show almost no deterioration. The colors remain vibrant. The threads are still strong enough to sew with. One conservator, speaking anonymously, described an unsettling experience. While cataloging the items, she held one of the thread spools up to the light. For just a moment, she said, she could swear she saw something in the thread itself. A pattern or a movement, as if the thread was alive and waiting to be used for some purpose that had not yet been fulfilled. The most recent discovery came in 2003. A metal detector enthusiast exploring the site of the old Bellemonte Plantation, long since reclaimed by forest and swamp, found a metal box buried 3 feet underground near where the slave cemetery had been. Inside the box were 3 items. 3 brass buttons, the kind used on expensive coats in the mid-19th century. Each button was engraved with initials: H.D., A.D., J.D., Henri, Armand, Julien Duval. The buttons showed signs of heat damage, as if they had been burned, but the fabric that would have held them, the coats themselves, were nowhere to be found. Just these 3 buttons, buried deliberately, marking a spot that held no bodies, no evidence, no answers. The box also contained a small piece of paper protected in a glass vial. The paper had a single sentence written in English in handwriting that matched none of the known samples from Celeste Marchand. The cloth remembers, the thread remembers, and what was sewn can never be fully undone. So what really happened at Bellemonte Plantation in the winter of 1851? Did Celeste Marchand possess supernatural abilities passed down from her mother, powers rooted in African spiritual traditions that white authorities couldn't understand or acknowledge? Did she literally sew 3 men out of existence, binding their essences to fabric and then unmaking them through practices that existed outside the bounds of accepted reality? Or is there a more rational explanation? Could the 3 Duval men have been murdered through conventional means, their bodies hidden so well they were never found, while Celeste used the coats and the symbols as psychological warfare, creating a narrative of supernatural vengeance that terrified the entire region? Some historians argue for a third possibility, that the Duval men, knowing that slave rebellions were increasing in frequency and violence in the 1850s, that whispers of abolition were growing louder, that their world was beginning to crack at its foundations, simply fled. They abandoned Bellemonte, left Louisiana entirely, started new lives elsewhere under different names. The coats, the symbols, the mysterious circumstances were all convenient covers for men escaping their own failing enterprise. But this theory has problems. Why leave at the height of cotton profits? Why abandon valuable property? Why all 3 men, separately, without any evidence of planning or coordination? Another theory, proposed by Dr. Marcus Webb in his 1952 book The Invisible Justice, Resistance and Folklore in Antebellum Louisiana, suggests that Celeste was part of a larger network of enslaved people who had organized a systematic resistance movement. The coats were signals, markers that identified targets for elimination. The disappearances were carried out by multiple people, carefully coordinated, leaving no witnesses and no evidence. The supernatural elements were deliberately cultivated to protect the network and terrify other plantation owners. This theory is compelling. We know that such networks existed. We know that enslaved people developed sophisticated communication systems, that they organized resistance in ways that white authorities rarely detected until it was too late. The symbols on the coats could have been communication, messages in a language that only certain people could read, but it doesn't explain the coats disappearing from the locked courthouse. It doesn't explain the physical impossibility of Julian vanishing from a room with one door that never opened. It doesn't explain the persistent phenomena at Bellemonte that drove away every subsequent owner. Perhaps the truth exists somewhere in the space between rational explanation and supernatural possibility. Perhaps Celeste did possess knowledge that we would now classify as psychological manipulation, herbalism, chemistry, combined with a deep understanding of symbolism and the power of belief. Perhaps she created circumstances that allowed people to see what they feared most. And in that fear, reality itself became malleable. Or perhaps something simply cannot be explained by the tools we currently possess for understanding the world. What we know for certain is this: 3 men disappeared. Celeste Marchand was involved. The coats existed, and then they didn't. And the story has persisted for over 170 years, retold and reshaped, but never forgotten. We know that the site of Bellemonte Plantation is still avoided by locals, that hunters who venture into that area of forest report feeling watched, hearing sounds that don't match any known animal, finding pieces of fabric hanging from trees that weren't there the day before. We know that the descendants of the enslaved community from Bellemonte still gather annually to remember those who suffered there, and some of them still speak of Celeste with a mixture of respect and wariness, as if her work is not yet complete. We know that the fabric and thread in the Louisiana State Museum remain inexplicably well preserved. that conservation staff report strange experiences, that visitors sometimes claim to feel overwhelmed by emotion when viewing these items. And we know that somewhere, perhaps, 3 coats still exist, empty but not empty, holding something that was once men but is no longer, waiting in darkness, sewn together with skill and rage and purpose, a testament to the power of those who history tried to render invisible. The story of Celeste Marchand reminds us that the past is never truly past, that the threads of history connect in ways we cannot always see, that justice denied does not disappear, it merely transforms, finding new paths, new methods, new ways to balance accounts that were never meant to be settled. To this day, no one knows the full truth of what happened at Bellemonte. The coats are gone. The bodies were never found. Celeste herself vanished into history, becoming legend, becoming symbol, becoming something more than one woman who lived and fought and perhaps achieved a victory that we still struggle to understand. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some questions are meant to haunt us, and some stories are meant to be told and retold, changing slightly with each telling, but always carrying the same essential truth, that even in the darkest circumstances, even when all power seems to rest in the hands of oppressors, there are ways to resist that cannot be seen, cannot be stopped, cannot be undone. The cloth remembers, the thread remembers, and what was sewn into the fabric of history in that terrible winter of 1851 continues to exist somewhere, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough or foolish enough to search for answers that may be too terrible to comprehend. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of Louisiana's darkest mysteries. If this story moved you, disturbed you, or made you think, please consider subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications. We explore the shadows of history together, our haunted community, searching for truth in places where others fear to look. Leave your theories in the comments. Tell us what you believe happened to the 3 Duval men. Share your own experiences if you've ever visited Louisiana, if you felt the weight of history in places where terrible things occurred. And remember, history is not just what we read in books. History is what we carry with us, the stories we tell, the mysteries we refuse to forget. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and never stop seeking the truth, no matter how dark the path may become. This has been the story of the slave who sewed her masters inside their own coats, the story of Celeste Marchand, the story of justice stitched in darkness. And it is a story that perhaps is not yet finished.